Hey Sugar Geeks! Today I'm going to show you how to panel a square cake using fondant and get super sharp edges. Coming up next on the Sugar Geek Show. Paneling is when you take fondant and you cover each side of the cake individually instead of covering the whole cake in one piece of fondant. The reason you want to do this, especially with square cakes, is you can get those super sharp edges without having to use your smoothers and spend a lot of time getting super sharp edges. Downside is, unless you have a super sharp edge buttercream cake, it's a little bit difficult. You have to go in and out of the freezer a few times, so it's kind of a little bit more time consuming. And some people don't like the fact that you can see the seams when you get really, really close. I promise you, nobody can see them but you. So I think it's a great technique to use. Some people think that paneling is easier than actually regular covering. So it's always good to have different options, you like to cover one piece, you like to panel, you like to do this dance. Another great thing is you can panel a cake in modeling chocolate. So if you don't want to use fondant or your client doesn't like fondant, but you still want to have something on the outside, you can use modeling chocolate. Okay, so to panel a cake, we need just a few tools. The most important tool is a brand new razor blade, which sounds weird, but it'll make sense later. So I have a big stack of razor blades that you can just get for super cheap at art stores. And you want it to be never used, because by the end of paneling, it will be sticky and dull and you won't ever want to use it again. You can use an X-Acto blade if that's all you have. Just try and make sure it's as clean as possible and as new as possible. Aside from our fondant, we also want to have a couple of boards, because we're actually going to roll our fondant out, put it on these boards to freeze before we panel, and that's how we get those super sharp edges. We also have a rolling pin, cornstarch poof, and some vegetable shortening for conditioning our fondant. We also have a square cake that has been chilled until it's perfectly firm. You can use ganache or buttercream or whatever you like. Just make sure it's got nice sharp edges to begin with, otherwise the paneling is not going to do much, for that. I definitely recommend you check out my tutorial on how to cover a square cake using acrylics or using the upside down method. So I've heated my fondant up in the microwave. This is Renshaw fondant, or you can use my LMF recipe. I always heat it in the microwave first for about 30 seconds or so, just till it's warm, and then I put some vegetable shortening on my hands, and then I'm going to condition it. You see how it's all torn and dry looking? Fondant always looks that way when it first comes out of the bag. So you want to warm it up, and we're going to pull it like taffy until it stretches and it's soft and shiny. Okay, so you can see the fondant is nice and shiny, so now it's ready. So I have my buttercream cake here that's been chilled overnight, so it's super firm. And I'm just gonna measure. It's 8 inches by 8 inches. So I know that for my first piece of fondant, you always wanna start with the top. It's gonna be 8 inches by 8 inches. So I'm gonna make 9 inches by 9 inches. Let's talk about rolling a square shape. When I was in pastry school, my pastry teacher, my chef, he told me that you always want to start with the shape that you want to end up with. Okay, so we're going to roll out a piece of fondant. It's roughly 1/2 inch thick, and it's already in a square. So we're going to try and keep it this way, putting down some cornstarch. By the way, this is a cornstarch poof inside of an unused knee sock. So I'm going to roll out and try and keep the shape of the square the entire time. Every time you roll, after a couple of rolls, you want to rotate your fondant, make sure it's not stuck to the table. Inevitably, you will have bubbles in your fondant. That is natural and it happens to everybody. So I like to use these pins. This is from a sewing kit and it has this little flat piece on the end, so it helps me to keep track of it so I don't lose it. I'm terrified that I'm gonna lose my pin in my fondant somewhere. It's my worst nightmare. So you can go in and pop all the little bubbles. And just do that as soon as possible so that you don't end up having holes in your finished piece of fondant. So see how there's a little bit, there's no fondant right there. You always want to roll towards wherever you want there to be more fondant. gonna come from the center and roll towards that. So that's how you can control the shape. So this is about 10 inches by 10 inches. So that's really, honestly, perfect. I don't have to trim it down, but I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. This should be the thickness that you would normally roll fondant out to, which is 1/8 of an inch to 1/16 of an inch. I'm transferring my fondant to just any kind of cake board or like placemat, something that's easily picked up and is lightweight. Once you start paneling really huge cakes, that can be a little bit of a problem, finding something big enough to put them on. I've used cookie sheets, I've used cutting boards, anything. Okay, so this is going to go into the freezer for about 5-10 minutes, depending on how cold your freezer is and how many times you open it. And while that's freezing, I'm gonna roll out my next panel. Next one, this is only 4 3/4 inches tall, 8 inches wide. Same process. And I can pretty much guarantee that all the sides are gonna be 4 3/4. So I'll just make them like 5 by 10. And then I'm gonna put my cake back in the fridge because you want this to stay chilled. I'm gonna use a ruler to make one side straight, and that's gonna be the bottom. That just makes your life easier. This is already pretty much the height that we need it to be. Just cutting off the excess. That is 5.5. And then I'm gonna trim just this side. And we're gonna put that into the freezer. Okay, so I have my chilled cake here. I've got my chilled fondant. You have to work kind of quickly, especially if it's humid, but you should be able to lift up your fondant without it losing its shape. So other tutorials that I've seen where they panel the cake, they cut it on top, but I have never ever been able to do that successfully. I always mess it up. So I take some parchment, put it on top, and for me this is easier. And I'm just gonna flip the whole cake over, just like we were doing the upside down method. Slowly, carefully. And then with your X-Acto blade, you just have to cut along the line of your cake, straight up and down as possible. But because the fondant is frozen, it won't lose its shape. Make sure you wipe off and clean your blade after each pass. You can also add a little bit of vegetable shortening to your blade if you feel like it's sticking. So you can see if you don't have a straight edged cake to start with, this is gonna be pointless. And then we can just flip it back over, put your cake board underneath. It just makes it easier to handle. I'm putting pressure, like I'm squeezing it, holding it like a sandwich, so that when I turn it over, I don't lose my grip. So here's my next piece. You can see why having the straight edge on the bottom is convenient, because you now have that straight edge right on the bottom and you don't have to mess with it. And you're just gonna use your fondant smoother to just make a nice connection. If you are using ganache, you will have to spray the ganache with a little bit of water to get this to stick. We've got our X-Acto blade here, and I'm gonna start cutting in from the top until I get to the top of my fondant. I'm gonna hold the end and just cut. I'm trying to hold my X-Acto blade as level with the top layer as possible. If you have any sort of jagged edges or anything, you can smooth them out. But freezing the fondant really helps minimize the dragging and the messing up of things. Same thing with the side. You want to just make sure you're trying to hold the X-Acto blade so it's perfectly flat against the buttercream. You don't even pay attention to this side. So then you have inevitably this little seam. So that's why you put the top on first, because from the front you don't really see the seam, but if you were looking like this close, sure, So I'm just gonna kind of push the fondant together and just use my finger to kind of smooth out that seam. And then what do you know? We're just gonna repeat this. If you feel like your cake is getting sticky, you can just put some cornstarch on it, and that sort of just absorbs that moisture so that your fondant smoothers don't stick anymore. All right, 2 more to go, and then we'll be done. So that is how you panel your square buttercream cakes in fondant. It is a little bit more time consuming than covering with just one piece of fondant, but as you can see, the results are very sharp square edges. If you like this video, please share it. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.